My name's Christian Kohl.
Louise Russell.
Ian Mulvany.
Joris from Rossum.
Lynsey Haire.
And then over to you, basically.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. All right, good afternoon. It's a very, let's say, a topic that lends itself for a good discussion, so we thought we introduce our initiative before we start to discuss it, and I'll already set the scene about what we're trying to do. So my name is Joris from Rossum. I work for digital science. I have written a report on blockchain for research 1 year ago only, but it looks like years ago. My history is mostly in publishing. My last role, I was Director of Publishing Innovation at Elsevier, and I was focusing on peer review innovations and the challenges in peer review. And I think actually peer review is typically a topic, and I hope you'll be convinced after this session, where the blockchain could actually make our lives a lot better. So we will discuss today a bit about the initiative, and then followed by a discussion about blockchain in general and this initiative. So why do we do this? Why do we started the blockchain for peer review initiative? Let me start by explaining that. First of all, it is a problem that really calls for a solution. We all know the challenges in peer review. There's a lack of recognition for reviewers. There is the lack of efficiency. It's more and more difficult to find reviewers. There's a lack of coordination in the review process. But also the process is intransparent. We should, and of course there's a call for us in the scholarly communication to be more transparent. So we really have to open the black box of peer review. Another reason why we do this initiative is more in general about transparency. There's a call for publishers to be more open what we want to do, but also, of course, as we've seen this morning in an excellent presentation from Louise, it is a very interesting technology, a very promising technology also for our industry. So we just have to start with experimenting, with piloting to see how it can be applied to our industry and make the processes better. So what do we try to deliver with this initiative? Basically, what we try to do is build an infrastructure whereby all the actors in the industry can share information around peer review. So we're talking about publishers, we're talking about institutions, we're talking about funders and institutions like ORCID. Because when we talk about the challenges in peer review, the lack of recognition, the lack of transparency, the lack of coordination, that could be solved when we start to, again, exchange information, share the data, open the black box of peer review. Not working in your own silo, but actually combine all the information and be more transparent about it. But of course there's a big challenge here when we talk about sharing information between publishers, between authors, reviewers, etc. And that is trust. Peer review is a very, trust is an extremely important aspect in the peer review process. We have the double blinds, the single blinds, the trust between the author, the reviewer and the editor, but also we have the trust between the publishers. Publishers are willing to share some information about peer review, but not everything. For example, specific names or specific article titles. And this is exactly in our aim to be more transparent, in our aim to share peer review information, why we think that the blockchain could be a solution. And because of these reasons, Louise mentioned some of the aspects of blockchain, and these are very relevant for our initiative. First of all, it allows us to build a decentralized data store, which means that we don't need a central owner, a central gatekeeper to store the information. And when we talk about the willingness of publishers of the industry to share information, not having a third party, let alone a commercial third party that hosts the data, makes it hopefully more likable for us to start to share the information. We talked about the distributed nature about it, makes it more safe and less prone to hacking. And then a third aspect which is extremely relevant when we're talking about sharing information as an ecosystem is that it's a transparent data store but pseudonymous, which means that identities and sensitive information can be kept confidential. The technology is really fit for that. So especially when we talk about peer review, when we talk about single blind, double blind, this is of course an extremely important element when we talk about being more transparent about the review process. I now give the word to Lynsey, who will talk more specific about the aims of this initiative.
Thanks, Joris. So our Blockchain for Peer Review initiative focuses on improving 4 key aspects of the journal and grant review process. Finding, by using blockchain technology to share and update reviewer profile information such as reviewers' availability or current review assignment workload, we can make the search for an appropriate and available reviewer very much easier. Recognition, the blockchain will also be used as a central data repository, which allows items to be pushed to institutions or recognition platforms. A good example here might be pushing data about reviewer activity to a user's ORCID profile, allowing them to gain recognition for their work. The blockchain is also potentially useful as a platform for peer review validation, allowing a traditionally black box process to be safely opened up if authorised parties wish to do so. As we know, trust is central to the business of academic publishing, so this validation process could have a variety of applications. Blockchain also makes the data more portable, allowing peer review histories to be transferred as articles move through journals, for example, in a manuscript transfer cascade, or if a journal were to change ownership and wanted to move manuscripts between systems, a process that can be particularly painful and expensive at the moment with existing technology. Our blockchain initiative is considering use cases from all parties involved in the peer review process: publishers, funders, institutions, editors, reviewers and authors, looking for opportunities to solve problems to which existing tech may not have been ideally suited. So, blockchain for reviewer management is the use case that I'm most excited by as a peer review nerd. So, reviewers are our most precious resource at the moment. We've all heard about the reviewer gap, the shortage of researchers prepared to act as reviewers when compared to growing numbers of submissions. Research presented by Ian Potter of Clarivate Analytics earlier this year showed a very real drop-off in reviewer agreements between 2013 and 2017. I believe the figures, if I recall correctly, were in 2013, were you to ask 10 reviewers to review a paper, you'd get roughly 4.5 agreements. In 2017, that number dropped to barely 3. So this shows that we really need to be doing some work to make reviewers' life easier and to preserve their goodwill. Currently, each journal's peer review system is an individual silo, and user profiles are not joined up by default. So, say, Rebecca reviewer's profile information that she's updated on one Scholar One journal site for Journal A is not automatically shared across all the other journal sites that she has accounts on, which she may not realise. This can be really frustrating for academic users, and blockchain may be able to address some of these issues. We propose to use the blockchain to share certain non-sensitive data points in a way that is useful to both journal editors and journal editors looking for referees, and also the academics who act as those referees. Editors will be able to see information on opted-in reviewers' availability, including how many review invites they currently have open, how many they've completed this year, and whether or not they've updated their details to say whether or not they're currently available or not. This could allow editors to make informed decisions on the likelihood of a positive outcome, saving their time, and avoids us sort of frustrating academics with yet another invite when they're already very busy. The blockchain will also allow us to push peer review systems metadata to various recognition platforms and institutions from just one single source. This functionality will be used to push data about a referee's review activity to an opted-in user's ORCID profile, allowing the auto-population of their reviewer recognition fields, ensuring academics are getting proper credit for the work they've completed. Not currently planned but possible is the use of the same mechanism to push data about opted-in users' peer review activities to funders or institutions, allowing for tracking of funding outcomes or a fuller picture of tenured staff's contribution to their academic community. This offers all stakeholders more reliable recognition of their efforts with minimal manual effort. The immutable nature of blockchain means that peer review process can be validated in case of concern. If there's a need to definitively demonstrate that an article was reviewed or to verify an editorial decision that was made, selected peer review nodes within the blockchain could be opened up to authorised users, allowing peer review to be validated. This could be particularly useful in cases of industry-wide misconduct, such as submission of bogus AI-generated papers or fake peer review rings. Publishers are increasingly having to work together to tackle misconduct or attempts to discredit peer review of particular fields. And the siloed nature of the data at the moment makes this kind of teamwork even more difficult. the blockchain could be used to share some of this information more easily and to share pseudonymized records between publishers, allowing sensitive personal information to be obfuscated, but for patterns, say, in timing or format of the submission to be detected via data analysis. As an industry, we need to be working together to increase trust in our ecosystem and distinguish the genuine publishers from the predatory, and the blockchain could be a useful technology for this. And finally, review data could be shared between titles or between publishers, facilitating manuscript transfer. This same concept could work well for society journals wishing to change publisher. It's a pretty painful experience at the moment if you try and change between systems. Previously, the spectre of data loss has made moves between systems pretty infrequent, as the data layout in System A may not easily correspond to the data layout in System B, leading to painful data loss. So this system offers the option to transfer data of review history between publishers and journals and gives us easy access to review history in case of articles transferred. So that's the plan for our pilot program, and these are our members. Currently, the members are Digital Science and Catalysis, where this all began, Taylor and Francis, Cambridge University Press, Springer Nature, and Carga, and we have Wellcome Trust and Orchid on board as advisory members also. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lynsey and Joris, for this presentation. Any questions from you? Well, we haven't seen this before, so anything immediate that comes to your mind you want to comment on?
I had a first question. I don't know whether it's too early to say, but are there any sort of early pieces of feedback or benefits that you could share at this stage?
Well, we're still in the proof of concept phase at the moment, so right now there's not too much to share. We're still very much in the planning phases.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And is there a timetable that can be communicated, or like when can we look for like actual results?
So we're aiming to have phase 1 completed by the end of this year, moving into phase 2 early next year.
Okay, nice.
That's the current timeline.
Cool. And if there are any questions from the audience, please just raise your hand and we'll pass. Yeah.
So I have a few comments, if I may. So I think one of the reasons why I was invited onto this panel is that I wrote a rather long blog post recently. I wrote about 6,000 words on why I don't think blockchain is an appropriate technology for our industry. So I'm going to politely dissent and disagree. Now, I think the practice of actually doing something and getting lots of partners on board is going to be invaluable, and I really commend the work that you're putting in, the partners that you've got on board. But I have some concerns about the choice of blockchain itself as a technology. So I'm just going to put out some thought pieces for the community, and I completely recognize that I could be wrong on this, and in fact I had a good conversation with Martijn, who's involved in the project, and he has made me rethink some of my objections. But for the sake of balance, I'm just going to stick my objections out there, right? So I looked into blockchain as a technology for some stakeholders in Sage a couple of years ago, just to explain internally how it works. And I have some concerns. I'll start with this. The technology itself is opaque. And so the algorithms and coding of blockchain systems are quite complex. We've seen many examples of blockchain systems that have been hacked. Ethereum had this embarrassing issue where they had to fork the entire thing because it turns out that code is not law. Law is law. I was looking at salaries for architects recently in London. Most architects come in at a salary of between 80k and 120k. Blockchain architects will cost you 145k. So there's something going on there. And so the sense that the technology is good is I'm not right there. The other thing is the benefits that you're talking about, this call for transparency, aiding peer review, the creation of infrastructure. I am 100% behind these. I think these are absolutely needed in our industry. I think the idea of a distributed database and a append-only log can really help solve those. But I think there are lots of other technologies that you could look to that could solve these as well. I would say, for example, looking at technologies built on top of BitTorrent will get you there. There's a really interesting project called the DAPT project, which is being used to roll out data sharing in a distributed peer-to-peer way amongst California libraries in association with the California Digital Library and the Internet Archive. So they've got like a work-in-progress thing going on there. Systems like Kafka are really mature, allow for event streaming processing and distributed networks, have really great support for things like subscribers, for fan-out architectures. So I think a lot of the use cases that you're going to encounter as you really understand the needs of your users that you're going to have to think about building from scratch are already supported by off-the-shelf, well-mature technologies that can be used to provide some of the kind of append-only encrypted data stores that you're looking at. My understanding from talking to Martijn is that you won't be looking at implementing proof of work for this product because you already have high trust in the system. You have high trust with the partners. Blockchain is really good in environments where there's low trust, where you're a creative working in Uzbekistan or in the Crimea, and you have no trust in the ownership of property or in the ability to get paid. It's not surprising that much of the emergent work on blockchain has come from Eastern Europe, which are low trust environments. But we work in actually quite a high trust environment. And so the core kind of value add that blockchain provides as a thinking point, I don't think we need. And so I don't think we need to take on the additional complexity. I'm also concerned about this concept of the idea of independence of these systems. Because when I was future projecting what this might look like in our industry, it struck me that someone might come up with a great solution. Those of us in the room who are publishers will have someone come in and say, oh, we need to implement this in our roadmap. And what that's going to look like is publishers are going to go and work with a vendor, because it's unlikely that we're going to spin up blockchain departments in our own organizations. And now all of a sudden you have this thing which is supposedly independent, but it's actually being run by a vendor. And we all have to work with the same vendor to have the benefits. And now it's not a distributed independent platform, it's just a centralized platform in practice. And so I have a bit of a concern there. I have
to remember all the questions before you.
Yeah. So I've got one more. I've got one more objection.
I choose the easiest one after this,
okay? After my final objection, I'm going to tell you what I think is great about what you're doing. Okay. So my final objection is when I read and looked at who was talking about using blockchain in scholarly publishing, it broke into two communities. There are communities of publishers who say, this is going to help us solve these challenges that we have around authentication, around peer review. It's going to help the Sci-Hub problem go away. It's going to help get us control once again on rights management, on access. And the other community who talk about blockchain are the ones who are saying, we need to tear down publishing and start from the ground up and have a completely distributed view of the world where there is no centralized authority, and we'll build all of these like distributed centralized platforms to reinvent publishing again. Now, I would put it to you that both views of the world probably can't coexist. And so maybe what's going on is we have communities of people who have seen needs, have seen those needs not being met by technologies, and a new technology has come along, and people are projecting onto it their expectations and hopes for a better future, without necessarily this being the thing that can carry us towards that future. What I would say that is fantastic about what you're doing is bringing all of these stakeholders together and really building out this system for trying to understand how we could do a much better job of sharing information about peer review, but doing it from like a workflow-centered point of view, a user-centered point of view, a stakeholder-centered point of view. I think that's invaluable work. I think there is an absolute need for creating new protocols and standards around sharing, around anonymization of that data, new metadata standards. Getting standards bodies together to work on this is really hard. It's really hard, painful, slow. You have to put a lot of work in. And so maybe the fact that blockchain has created impetus to get people together to talk about these things is enough. Maybe that's already going to be fantastic. But what I hope is that we'll come to a conclusion of creating those standards, but that doesn't actually get built on top of the blockchain technology. In fact, what I'm calling for is BINO, blockchain in name only, and I think then we can proceed to get to like a much better and glorious future for the kinds of problems that you've outlined at the beginning of your presentation. Those were it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I'll let you reply first, and then we'll take the question.
No, I think these are actually all valid points, and I think I agree with most of them. So let me go through them one by one. First of all, it's a nascent technology, what you mentioned. It's a very early technology. It will take us, before we have something substantial, it will take us years.
Yeah.
At the same time, that doesn't mean we should be discouraged by starting with it. And hence we have the pilot, we start with it, we see where it ends. And it's already indeed what you say, it's very extremely educational to be already working together to look at standards, things like that. The second point you mentioned about, now I forgot it, I should have taken my note. About the blockchain technology itself and alternatives. Our assumption is that using the blockchain for solving these problems is the most cheap, efficient way to do it.
Okay.
And why? Because we think it's a natural technology to solve the problems. We have the technology of encryption is extremely useful for peer review, for supporting these very sensitive processes. Decentralization is very useful because we don't, as an industry, want to have another third party who basically can exploit the peer review process. If it's not, and hence also the pilot, I mean, our budget is not sky high. If it turns out it's more expensive, then we will turn for an alternative. And so the goal is peer review, transparency. And we test blockchain as an opportunity to do so.
Okay, great.
That's something we should be very, of course, not using blockchain can't get you into, presentations like this.
And let's be clear, right? That is not to be undersold. Because the most valuable commodity that most people in this room have is attention. Yeah. And getting people's attention on these questions is the hardest thing to break. Turns out that the technologies can get us so far, but what we're really talking about here are trying to find social answers to these questions and getting the social buy-in to solve those problems.
And maybe one last comment, because so when I wrote a report in November last year, there were only a handful of initiatives, and what you've seen in the last months is really an enormous amount of initiatives. And what you say, you have the disruptive, the people say, oh, finally we can get rid of the publishers and the whole, we can basically start all over again. I don't believe in that either. I think that's a too simplified idea about publishing and the complexities of our industry and the culture. So I think there's not, what you also mentioned, it's not one technology. It's a combination of different technology we can use. We can have a cryptocurrency for science, for example, to solve one of the motivational problems around peer review, for example. We can solve issues around digital rights management. We can solve establishing intellectual property. There's so many things we can do.
We can certainly speak of solving them.
Well, I think there's a big difference here between the potential and reality, and I also wrote in my report about it. I mean, technology is not the sole driver of changes in our industry. It's much more complex. But if you think about problems around our business models, if you think about problems about irreproducibility, around peer review, the limited metrics, potentially it's very related to this technology. And it's not saying it will be the panacea for all the troubles, but it's certainly worthwhile to explore. And also maybe to mention again, we have been, as a publishing industry, extremely innovative in applying new technologies, in making our, basically our service to the research community better. We were the first to really implement internet technology, and with all its problems, it was extremely successful. And I think we should do the same with blockchain. We should really actively work on it and see how we can basically change the way we serve the academic community.
Okay, now for your question.
Sorry. I've forgotten.
Sorry.
I was interested from the GDPR perspective, because it seems to me, I mean, I think the principle's a really good idea, but if I'm a reviewer and I've agreed to review a paper and then I find somewhere along the line that I've got a bad reputation for, and then you can't anonymise that data because it's about me, and you need to, otherwise there's no value to anyone else to know how many papers I've got to review. So it's just, I mean, I don't disagree with what you're trying to do. I just worry that whether you're going to have a problem that we're going to have to try and unpick later in terms of where that data's gone.
So the specific GDPR issue isn't around anonymisation. You can construct it in a way in which the reviewers are presented onto the blockchain in a way in which they are anonymized, and so that's okay from a GDPR point of view. But if you construct a system in which, for example, at a later point in time, they reveal their identities, and then you can backtrack their identities to that token in the blockchain, the GDPR issue is that they cannot technically be removed. And so the GDPR includes a right to have your data removed from systems, and that's the specific technical issue which is a real head scratcher for blockchain and for append-only logs.
That's what Brexit is all about, right?
Yeah.
Well, yes, I would say we're already dealing with this issue of not being able to erase people's records from systems right now in standard peer review systems. There are, I believe that there is a clause within GDPR about fair use, where if it would sort of completely destroy your records of peer review to delete this person from the system, then you are able to keep a ghost record of this person, provided you don't contact them again, provided you don't hold unnecessary details. And I believe we could look at applying the same logic to this problem as well. I'd also just like to come back to your comment about bad reputation. We're talking about availability only. We're definitely not looking at a system of like classifying reviewers as good, bad or mediocre. That's definitely not an aim of this project.
But even if it was just the you know, how busy they were, I mean, I think the point there is if it's challenging enough when it's within your own systems to remove somebody, how, God's name, is it easy if it's 3 steps past you and you've already released that data? So I know it's sort of, it's something we can laugh about in terms of Brexit, but if we build something, that the unpicking of that in the future could be quite challenging. So anyway,
we're definitely looking at building in opt-ins as well, specific, explicit opt-ins. So there will be opportunities to opt out of this if you don't want your data shared in this way.
So it feels really hard that you know, brilliant for getting up there and standing up there and having a bunch of quite sceptical people possibly sitting there talking at you. So I can't believe I'm going to pick an argument with Ian now. This feels a bit like a mouse approaching a cat and going, oi, oi, you want some? But I still think we've got an anonymisation problem. Because I don't believe, in a large population of people, you've got enough people in the system that you can, in this particular world, have a reasonable expectation of anonymity. But once you start to get into the niche of any particular field of research, quite frankly, the way the world works in scholarly research, everybody has a pretty good idea who might be doing what in terms of the peer review. So I'm dubious about, I'm generally sceptical about anonymisation anyway, and the ability to do that, because there always seems to be a way to figure out who somebody is. So I think that's one of the issues around what you're trying to do. The other one I'm still trying to get my head around is, as I understand blockchain, it requires, it's predicated on the network effect. It's predicated on enough, if you're generally saying it's going to be decentralized, and Ian, I think you've got some questions about that, but if you're genuinely saying it's going to be decentralized, enough people have got to be persuaded to participate and do the work in the network for the thing to work.
No. So when you look at the components for the kind of entire end-to-end blockchain system that operate for something like Ethereum or Bitcoin, they operate in what's really called a low trust environment, and so you need enough people in the network to do this thing called proof of work.
Yeah.
But the proposal here, if you read the paper, is not to have proof of work, but rather to have a contractual agreement amongst the participants. And in that case, you can just have like 2 people or 1 person.
Then it's not decentralized, is it?
That was, I think,
it either is decentralized or it's not decentralized. And if it's decentralized, and that's one of the arguments being put forward, you have to have a network of people to allow a thing to be decentralized. So this is, can you tease that back out again? Because it was in your slide, wasn't it?
I actually thought you were going to ask a different question. But
I'm just going to come back to you on that. It can still.
If you answer the question, I'm fine with it.
Yeah, it can still be decentralized, right? Because the point about decentralization is there's no one source of truth for the database necessarily. And the point here in this environment is everyone trusts each other not to tamper. I was going to use a cruder word, but we're being recorded. To tamper with the database. We're all good actors, but no one person has ownership. And so when rights come in from the network, we accept those. And we accept them in close to real time, and we don't have a suspicion around those rights, so we don't have to do this thing called proof of work to test them. And so that means you can do that with low costs and low overheads. But there are other, like BitTorrent does exactly the same thing. BitTorrent is decentralized, has no proof of work. You just trust that people will, put the right things on the feeds. So
maybe to talk about the trust issue, because that's crucial. We don't have a mistrust that we think that publishers will send fake data to the blockchain because they have no interest in it. The trust issue that we're trying to solve is that we want to make sure that the publishers are comfortable to send their review information to that blockchain, and that the other publishers don't see confidential information. The trust factor should be such that a reviewer is confident by having their information anonymized shared on the blockchain, and making sure that the author doesn't see their name. That's the trust we have to solve. That is really the challenge we have. And maybe to go back to GDPR, if you would ask me what's the biggest headache now, that it's definitely GDPR. Not maybe in theory, but it's to convince the legal team actually that it's now relevant to GDPR. Everyone is really, really worried about it. In terms of technology, I think yes, we have our challenges, but GDPR is definitely something we have to also educate the internal teams about.
Thanks. I mean, you're all very brave.
Any more questions from the audience before we move on? Okay. These are this is a great panel because I don't even have to ask any questions. It's just taking care of itself. That is amazing. Yeah, so basically that was about like one concrete application of blockchain in publishing, or at least a proof of concept that is being looked at. You presented some other cases this morning. Any other fields where you think the central tenet might be useful of like decentralization, encryption, maybe anonymity, even if it's not 100%. Any other use cases you have like already in the back of your heads for the follow-up phase?
Well, so I'll just say that I know there's at least one other organization out there also working on a blockchain for science. They have, it's from the person who founded ScienceMatters.io, and they have a coin and a token called the Eureka coin.
Ah, okay, yeah.
And I met with them, and I met with Laurie and their technical founder, and they're hoping to do the world's first blockchain journal on the blockchain. So
okay.
And I think that's like a niche, that's like, that could work,
yeah.
That's like, see if the community puts its money where its mouth is, or its coins where its encryption is, if you like. So, and I think the other kind of use case for these kinds of distributed systems are around private sharing of lab data, and so not in the blockchain, but using this distributed protocol DAT. I know that some pharma companies have put networks in place across different facilities to allow highly sensitive pharma data to be shared across their facilities over a network, because it's a network that isn't associated with the web and has its own encryption protocol. I think there's a strong use case for that kind of application.
Mm-hmm. Anything that came your way while you were researching that?
Generally in publishing or more broadly?
Well, I think mainly in publishing, but if there's anything else you want to share, go ahead.
I mean, I think within the publishing field, there are some examples more on the trade side of things, or sort of potentially disruptive for the trade industry, where there are some experiments for authors who might want to self-publish. So I think one's called Publica, where basically you sort of set up a campaign for a book that you're writing, you set your token price, and then you pre-sell your tokens and use that sort of investment to continue writing the book. And then there's a smart contract, so when that book's sold, you get a copy of the book and potentially a percentage of royalties. So I think, again, that's sort of trying to support self-publication and disrupt the current system, but it's another interesting one, a bit like mycelium.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, as mentioned, I think it can be applied to several areas in our work that are problematic: peer review, reproducibility, limited metrics. I think the real interesting potential application would be if we would build a system whereby every time a researcher performs a certain activity, so whenever they do a peer review, whenever they upload data, whenever they get cited or published, if we would store that in one central, well, decentralized place, it's confusing terms, that actually would really solve many of our problems. If we would basically not only know when a researcher is cited or publishes, but whenever they do the other activities, whenever we can track the research prior to publication, we can build better metrics, we can make science more reproducible. And I think that is the real interesting application, because with the current technology, again, we need a central gatekeeper, we need a database owner. And that's why we also have this many systems that researchers have to work with. But again, potentially extending the peer review blockchain and allowing researchers to basically have all their activities stored, then we could actually, again, build better metrics, make science more reproducible, etc. So again, that's very far away, I know, but I think it's a very interesting potential to consider.
So I've got like two questions around that. So you've got a scenario that you're working on where there's no proof of work because it's just simpler, it makes the system tractable. But when you do introduce like these points of recording for researchers for each of their activities, I think there's an implicit assumption there that they're going to have some reward mechanism. And in the wider blockchain system, that reward mechanism comes out of this proof of work where coins get generated. And then there's a question, what do those coins represent socially in the system, and on what might they be spent? And so I think that to get to that scenario, what one really needs is the impetus of funders saying that they will convert those coins for funding. And so you end up in a scenario where maybe you can get there in one subdiscipline with one forward-looking funder, but if you can't, you've got this very difficult need to do an entire flip and transition change into a new system. Yeah. And so while there's often been a call for wanting to give credit for the full life cycle of the process of the researcher, the truth tends to be that researchers are very laser focused on the reward mechanisms as they see them in place. Yep. And it's very hard to shift them to behaviors around a promised reward system that may hypothetically exist in the future. So how do you imagine one might make that transition?
There are a couple of elements in your point. The one thing I would like to stress is that of course, the discussion about rewarding reviewers has been long, and we talked with Elsevier, probably talked at TNF also about it. The currency for researcher is reputation, right? It's all about reputation. The reasons why people are now focusing on publications and citations is because we don't collect the data about other activities in a structural way. We start to do it.
Say yine.
Well, we start to do it, but again, it's not structural enough to build solid metrics around it.
I agree about that. Yeah.
I think if we have a mechanism whereby we really do structurally collect all the data points and we build better metrics around that, that is the kind of motivation you're looking for. I don't necessarily believe in coins. I believe in reputation, and blockchain could help there.
Okay.
In America, at least, they care about two things. Right? They care about getting more money to do more research from the funder, and they care about getting tenure. And you ask any group of researchers out there, and the one thing they will say is, I look at all the work I do by, does it help me or does it hinder me getting tenure? So that's the reward structure in a nutshell. I know it's a little bit different in the UK, okay, but it's still getting funding and getting reward at the end of the day that develops a successful researcher. So I suppose any of those other things that are out there about coins or whatever else it might be, unless it plugs into that very basic researcher Maslow hierarchy of tenure-based needs, I don't think any of them are going to pay a jot of attention to it.
But that's why there's a funder on the sheet, and that's why we also work with institutions.
Again, the Wellcome Trust I find particularly interesting because I've watched the Wellcome Trust have conversations with researchers they fund, and it's been interesting to see the researchers feed back to the Wellcome Trust, and it's been interesting to watch the Wellcome Trust struggle or otherwise to understand the feedback that they're getting from the people that they're funding.
So on the funder thing, one of the weird things when you talk to some funders, like I talked to Gates like a few years ago, they don't know what's being published with the money that they give out because there's like we talk about like technical debt in our systems. You should see some of the systems funders have; they're awful, and they don't know, and we do a bad job of telling them, and so I would posit that like a more bang for your buck kind of investment as an industry would be if we all just got FundRef working and we all did a much better job of putting really robust data around which funders were associated with which papers, and putting that into, God forbid, a centralized database like Crossref, I think that would move the field forward. And if we can't do that, what makes us think we're going to be able to make it work in a distributed system? I would say.
Yeah, maybe to add to that, you have a very fair point. If we build better metrics as an ecosystem, and not just starting with the researcher, not starting with the funder, but as an ecosystem, then we can really improve metrics. Then we can really make sure that tenure is not just built on 2 data points. But also for that reason, we started with a picture whereby we have institutions are going to be part of this, the funders are going to be part of it, the publishers are going to be part of it, and we work together to share the data and together to build the better metrics. Because I agree with you, we have to do it, as an ecosystem.
It's a really easy problem to work on.
There's a challenge.
Yeah.
But it feels as though the philosophy of a lot of these conversations is pushing us to that conversation about shared infrastructure. So maybe centralization, decentralization is not really the question. It's about the need for more shared infrastructure in our ecosystem rather than having the silos and the vendor lock-in and so on. So that's what it really, feels like to me, that it's, the philosophical output of the proof of concepts is more about having that conversation and in a more meaningful way.
Yeah. And maybe to add to this, just before we take the question, I saw a presentation on blockchain at the Frankfurt Book Fair. Was it last week? I don't know, some days ago. And was by a German guy, and he basically said, well, identifiers don't work because they are owned by a central, DOI is owned by Crossref, which is not right, we know that, but that was his position, and that's why we need blockchain for identifiers, basically, and that's the kind of confusion that is going on. In some places we have very good shared infrastructure. I mean, Crossref has been the most successful joint venture I know of. But in other places, it's really a question how do we move forward here?
I feel one of the most important applications might be to speed up communication of science or research, because at the moment we have a problem in that if I discover something in the lab, I don't want to just tweet that because someone else is going to write a paper on it. So I'm going to keep it close to my chest, and so maybe a year later it's published. That's a year lost. A very good example, I'm sure you're familiar, analogy is the Stack Exchange or Stack Overflow, which programmers use to ask questions and answer questions. You can go on there, you are anonymized or pseudonymized? I think you're pseudonymized. So I'm KB545, but you don't know who I am.
We know now.
What's your password?
Damn. So I can ask a question or answer questions, and if I ask a question, people fight to answer as soon as possible because they get points for it. They just get a thumbs up, like a Facebook like. So that's an example, I feel, of very, very quick exchange where you can't be trumped and communication moves fast, and perhaps a blockchain within that could help.
Well, maybe to give you another solution to that. I think there was a survey a couple of months ago asking researchers what keeps you from sharing data. And there were 2 problems. First is, what do I get out of it? And second, the fear of losing intellectual property. Again, blockchain could solve that. Why? We could create a coin, a token for researchers. So whenever I share my data set and somebody uses it, we could connect it to a coin. So I could earn coins or tokens by sharing my data. Second, if I upload my data set on the blockchain and I create a hash, I can always establish it was my data set. I was the first one with that idea or that data set. So actually the combination of those two things could make sharing data more attractive for researchers.
There's I think there's a kind of a division, and I don't know about you, but in conversations with publishers, I sometimes find that some people like to jump to technical conclusions for social problems. And while we might be able to optimize certain processes or parts of the workflow by using whatever, blockchain, distributed databases, shared infrastructures, the central problem won't go away. That's a supply and demand problem. There's more and more articles for the stagnating number of reviewers, and that is not going to evaporate because we have maybe a slightly better recognition mechanism, I think.
Well, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, I think there are some opportunities, certainly having looked at data that Wiley published. It's a little out of date now, but Verity Warren's work on the reviewer gap and TNF's own work on this. Currently, we are getting loads of submissions from China, but we are not asking Chinese researchers to contribute to the peer review ecosystem. They're being shut out. Mm-hmm. So I think there is an opportunity there. There is an untapped resource. There's also some work to be done. If they haven't previously participated in peer review, perhaps there's a need for some training, some outreach, but I'm not certain that's a blockchain problem. I think this is a wider industry problem.
As you've started this project and started engaging with these stakeholders, did you get any hopes, fears, or feature requests that were surprising in that process?
I would say Joris was the person who initiated this project, so I'd defer that to you, I think.
I think the reaction has been very positive in the sense that everybody recognizes that there are challenges, but we haven't solved the way we haven't found a way to solve it. So I think actually the reaction has been very, very positive in the sense that we're all trying to, to put energy in trying to solve this with the best intentions. So I think the real challenges are, the challenges at the moment are things like GDPR, and the real challenges are, of course, when we start to engage with real journals, with reviewers, but until now, I think from the publisher perspective, the reactions have been very positive.
How much time do we have left?
We're actually running a bit late, so we can take a couple of questions.
Wow. Yeah, we can get out of here.
Yeah?
I get to have the last question.
No, it has to be a very good question, you know.
Very quick. I was just wondering, I think I saw the word portability somewhere. Is that built into this concept? I was just trying to understand how much the idea is that an article would be able to take this peer review that's done with it to some way address this problem of reviewer fatigue and too many papers, not enough reviewers.
It's definitely something I think we're looking at. I think portability of peer review is definitely something that I'm very concerned with in my role in peer review at Taylor & Francis. I believe there is a lot of wasted effort at the moment that could be sort of capitalised upon better than we're doing at the moment, and portability of reviews between journals could be a good way to address that. But I think the community needs to buy into that, and at the moment that's the real challenge that I see. I think editors like to have manuscripts reviewed by their preferred reviewers, and aren't always keen to accept the judgments of people that they didn't pick themselves, may not know the identity of. So again, it's a problem we're definitely looking at. I think blockchain could offer some solutions here.
We'll need to be able to distinguish between the human reviewers and the AI reviewers on the blockchain.
Right. Any closing remarks?
Hope to be here next year and present the results.
Looking definitely forward to the. So you can Louise can do an updated report on 20 more initiatives, and
It'll
you
be
can.
The next thing.
I'll certainly let you know if I have a Damascene moment and the scales fall from my eyes.
Okay, then maybe as a closing remark from me and something you can take home with you and think about, what I found fascinating, and I'm not an economist and I don't know anything about currencies and banks and stuff like this because I did humanities and a bit of computer science at university, but I find it quite interesting that everybody is launching their own currency, coin, whatever, and everybody is assuming that it's going to work out and it's going to be stable and it's going to be able to interface with the real world or other payment systems. And I don't think whether that's just optimism or a bit naive, but I think it's interesting, and maybe that's a topic for a separate discussion where we have someone from the Bank of England or who really knows about this stuff. Thank you for the lively discussion and for the presentation. And thank you.